The sinister truth behind Casey Jones. He wasn't supposed to die that night. They called him a hero, a man who died with one hand on the whistle and the other on the brake, slowing a doomed train to save everyone on board. That's the story they told your grandparents, the one immortalized in songs, murals, and history books. But what if that story wasn't true? What if Casey Jones didn't die a hero, but as a casualty of something far more disturbing? Before we unravel the hidden truth, make sure to subscribe, like, and leave a comment below. Your support helps us keep uncovering the stories history tried to bury. Behind the smiling songs and bronze statues lies a trail of neglected warnings, corporate pressure, and silent manipulation. Casey Jones may not have chosen to be a legend. He may have simply been the most convenient man to sacrifice. And the more you dig, the more the facts begin to crack the myth. Because the real story doesn't begin with a whistle. It begins with a decision. A decision that placed him on a train he was never supposed to drive. Now let's follow that track and see where it really leads. In the soft glow of a Tennessee dawn, a steam engine cut through the quiet countryside like a promise, dependable, loud, and always on time. At the helm stood Casey Jones, the railroad's most beloved engineer. With one hand gripping the throttle and the other always ready on the whistle, he wasn't just driving a train. He was driving the spirit of a growing nation. Children idolize him. Folk singers praise him. His legend, passed through generations, painted him as a fearless man who gave his life to save his passengers. But legends have a strange way of hiding the edges they don't want us to see. He was immortalized in ballads. Casey Jones, he died at the throttle with the whistle in his hand. The story goes that, despite the odds, he stayed on board while others jumped, slowing the train just enough to save every soul on board. A hero, a martyr, a man who knew the value of duty. America needed figures like Casey, simple men turned myth, symbols of progress, discipline, and sacrifice. But there was one problem. The story felt too perfect. No questions were ever asked, and those who had doubts were quickly forgotten. The official version became gospel. The Illinois Central Railroad embraces death as a symbol of dedication. Monuments were erected. Children were taught his name in school. His face was etched into murals and stamps. But the more his legend grew, the quieter the details around his final hours became. What was he doing there that night? Why was he the one driving a train behind schedule under dangerous conditions? These questions were buried beneath decades of patriotic pride and romanticism, until whispers began to resurface. Some locals began to talk. Families in Vaughn, Mississippi recalled that Casey wasn't supposed to be on that train at all. He had volunteered to cover another engineer's shift. Rumors claimed the regular driver refused the job due to mechanical concerns and time constraints. If true, it wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a setup. The man America turned into a legend may have been placed in a position no one else wanted, and paid the price for someone else's caution. But questioning the myth meant confronting the people who built it. And that's where the Ray story begins. Not with a whistle, not with the wreckage, but with a decision that put Casey Jones on that train in the first place. Was he a hero or a scapegoat? As the song played on and statues were carved, someone, somewhere, benefited from the silence. And once you pull that thread, the whole story starts to unravel. By the end of the 19th century, the railroad industry wasn't just the backbone of American progress. It was a brutal machine. Conductors and engineers were often pushed beyond human limits. Schedules were tighter than ever, with companies competing for speed records and market dominance. If a train ran late, heads rolled. Safety was a secondary concern. Time was king. For engineers like Casey Jones, that meant running engines down hazardous tracks in unforgiving conditions with little sleep and zero margin for error. But Casey had something most didn't: a reputation for never running late. That reputation became a trap. Supervisors and dispatchers relied on Casey to pull off the impossible, and he did time and time again. But each victory pushed the expectations further. When the call came to cover for another engineer who refused to run a delayed train that night, it wasn't just a favor. It was a test. He was handed a near impossible route, tasked with making up lost time under intense corporate pressure. Documents from internal memos of the Illinois Central Railroad show growing concerns about driver fatigue, but no action was taken. Casey wasn't chosen for safety. He was chosen for speed. There was another problem. The track he was scheduled to run had recently undergone questionable maintenance. Workers had raised warnings about uncoordinated train orders and communication failures between stations. These red flags didn't slow the system down. They were ignored. What mattered was moving freight and passengers on time. In this climate, engineers became expendable tools. If something went wrong, it was easy to blame the man behind the throttle. The system was designed to protect the company, not the crew, and that night, all the pieces were in place for disaster. The man Casey replaced had allegedly refused to run the route that night due to mechanical concerns and foggy weather ahead. But that fact never made it into the newspapers. Neither did the testimonies of local workers who claimed the schedule that night was unrealistic. Instead, the focus was shifted to Casey's bravery, a distraction, perhaps, from deeper negligence. A mini-twist emerged years later, when the son of the station manager found old letters that revealed internal debates about pulling the train altogether. Yet they pushed forward. The myth needed a martyr, not a moment of caution. And just like that, the whistle that once echoed as a symbol of American heroism began to sound like something else, a warning cry, lost in corporate ambition. Casey's fate was sealed long before the crash, not by weather or chance, but by a system that valued image over integrity. As we look closer, we must ask, was his death just a tragic outcome or the predictable result of a culture built on silent exploitation? The crash happened in the early hours of April 30th, 1900, near Vaughn, Mississippi. The official account tells us that Casey Jones died saving everyone else, staying in the controls to slow the train and reduce the impact. But buried beneath the myth is a more disturbing version. The accident was brutal. Jones' body was found mangled, still clutching the brake. But at least one other crew member also died, and several passengers were severely injured. The company needed a clean narrative. So they erased the chaos and elevated Casey into a solo savior, conveniently masking the deeper flaws that led to the wreck. Witnesses at the scene reported a lack of flagmen and missing warning signals on the track that night. Safety procedures that should have stopped the train miles earlier. But these reports were left out of the investigation summary. Instead, the blame was softly placed on Casey himself for pushing the train too hard. It was a clever maneuver. He couldn't defend himself, and turning him into a legend would silence uncomfortable questions. Internal correspondence, later uncovered in private archives, reveals that top officials at Illinois Central coordinated public relations efforts within hours of the crash, aiming to preserve the dignity of the company. One conductor, who worked that line for years, claimed in a private letter that the wreck could have been prevented with a single telegraph message. That message never came. A telegraph operator, interviewed decades later, admitted he was told to hold communication to avoid delay penalties. If true, this was no accident. It was a failure orchestrated by fear of corporate punishment. But the company buried it. They funded memorials, encouraged songs to be written, and even paid for a glowing obituary. Casey's wife was given a public ceremony, but behind closed doors, she fought for years to receive full compensation. Then came the most chilling discovery. A railroad logbook missing from official archives turned up in the state sale in the 1970s. In it, a note scribbled in the margin read, "Run the 382 hard. Casey won't say no." The handwriting matched that of a senior dispatcher known for pushing engineers past legal limits. No action was taken, no name exposed. The logbook was quietly acquired by a collector and never entered into legal record. Once again, the machine had protected itself. And Casey, the symbol of duty and discipline, remained a perfect decoy. His face appeared in newsreels. His name became a legend, and his story was sold as inspiration for generations of workers. But what if that story was built to distract us from the very system that destroyed him? When a man becomes myth too fast, it's often to bury the truth too deep. We're left with a question no monument dares to answer. If Casey Jones hadn't died that night, what secrets might he have lived to tell? In American folklore, the hero who dies at his post becomes more than a man. He becomes a symbol. Casey Jones wasn't just an engineer. He became the embodiment of sacrifice in the age of industry. The sound of the train whistle, once a signal of arrival, was transformed into a funeral song, long, piercing, and echoing through the southern night like a final breath. That sound still haunts the towns his train once passed. But what if that whistle didn't honor his life, but warned us of what was done to him? The railroad became a modern altar, and Casey its offering. In stories, he is always alone in the cab, brave and stoic, choosing duty over life. But this version silences everything else. The fear, the exhaustion, the system behind him. His silence and death made him the perfect figure. No complaints, no contradictions. His sacrifice became a tool to silence others. Workers who follow were expected to match his devotion, without questioning the cost. And when they didn't, they were reminded, be like Casey. His legend was no longer a story. It became control. Even the folk song that immortalized him is strangely upbeat, rhythmic, even joyful. But beneath the melody is a ritualized denial. The lyrics praise the man, but omit the system. It's a selective memory, one that turns tragedy into entertainment. Sociologists argue that this transformation is common in capitalist mythology, turning laborers into heroes, only once they're gone. In doing so, the system maintains its power, making a fall of one man an uplifting tale instead of a call for change. The silence around the Real Casey Jones is not accidental. It's curated. The symbols are everywhere. The iron tracks that never bend. The time cards no man could meet. The red lantern glowing at the edge of the track. Ignored. They represent the invisible forces that shape ordinary lives into extraordinary tragedies. Casey's story, retold in classrooms and ballads, omits these quiet details. His death wasn't just a moment. It was a message rewritten so many times that its original warning was lost. But every now and then, when the whistle blows in a distant town, people still stop and listen, not to remember, but to wonder. What else have we turned into legend to avoid facing the truth? How many more Casey Jones figures have we buried under murals and melodies? His silence became a monument, but the real story is what that silence was hiding. And that leads us to the final, most uncomfortable question of all. What if we were never supposed to know the truth? Casey Jones became an icon not because he lived, but because he died in a way that served a narrative. He was remembered not for who he truly was, but for what the railroad and the country needed him to be, a perfect symbol of loyalty, sacrifice, and silent obedience. But symbols are dangerous when built on erasure. The Real Casey, with his exhaustion, doubts, and refusal to say no, was buried beneath marble plaques and cheerful songs. His family lived in the long shadow of that myth, and the system that created it never had to answer for what it took from them. His story is repeated in different forms across time. Workers who break their backs for corporations that later turn their deaths into slogans. Artists whose suffering is turned into inspiration. Soldiers whose final moments are edited for television. The legacy of Casey Jones is a mirror we avoid looking into. It reveals a society that only honors sacrifice once it's useful, and once the voice behind it can no longer speak. His silence was convenient, his death marketable, his humanity lost. But we remember. We look past the song, past the polished stone, past the commemorative stamps. And we ask, who benefits when legends are simplified? Who profits when a man's warning becomes a lullaby? The answers aren't comfortable. They aren't heroic, but they are necessary. Because behind every clean, uplifting story is a truth that someone worked very hard to bury. Casey's legacy isn't just about trains or whistles. It's about power and the stories we tell preserve it. And that's why we tell stories like this. Not to ruin childhood songs, but to free the real people from behind the myths. When we see Casey as a man, not a martyr, we see the weight he carried. The pressure, the fear, the silence. And we finally hear the warning in that final whistle, not a cry of triumph, but a scream into the night, a scream that echoes still, waiting for someone to finally listen. So next time you hear his name, remember this. He wasn't supposed to die that night. And maybe, just maybe, the real tragedy is that no one stopped it, because the story that came after was worth more than the life it replaced. If this story made you pause, think, or feel something deeper, Consider subscribing to the channel. These forgotten truths deserve to be heard, and your support helps us keep digging. Comment your thoughts below and become a channel member to help us uncover the next legend that history tried to bury. More stories like this are on the way. Don't miss our next chilling revelation.